Okay, thanks everyone for joining. We're going to get started now. Welcome to the Digital Archaeology Group lecture. If you've been to these before, I'm probably a new face. My name is Alicia Walsh, and with the help of Agnes, taken over the organization of this from Alex Branson. And today I'm happy to welcome Kelly Schoueri from Maastricht University, who's working on her PhD on 3D scholarship. And she's going to be presenting cracking the 3D Paradata Puzzle. So, do you?
Thank you, Alicia. Very broadly, the topic of my presentation is on 3D paradata of heritage visualizations and what we can do with it in a dynamic virtual environment. And just to kind of give a bit of background about me, my professional journey originally started in archaeology, but after my master's, I started to segue to science communication using 3D heritage visualizations. And then from there, I began to use that same technique to ask and answer questions about the past, like research questions about the past. But since I started my PhD, I've been focusing more on what is the current state of 3D scholarship among the humanities disciplines. And primarily, I want to see where this kind of work can fit in within the wider scholarly ecosystem. And this is something I've been investigating both in the context of my PhD research, as well as within my role as a research assistant with the PURE3D project, which was led by my PhD supervisors, Kostas Papadopoulos and Susan Schreibman. So in my research, it's been quite clear that one of the most critical requirements of integrating 3D scholarship relates to this idea of academic practice of supporting claims. So when we write a research article, we use references and footnotes, and we provide data sets, and we include graphs and figures, and we do all of this to help illustrate our narrative. But these conventions can also serve to signal to readers that our research is well-founded. Yeah, well, with scholarly 3D outputs, we don't really yet have this kind of formalized tradition, and it could be problematic to try to transfer these from the text-based convection into a 3D research environment. But instead, what we do have is something called Paradata, which is kind of the closest equivalent to supporting claims or making footnotes for 3D heritage. So the puzzle, as I see it, is to come up with ways to map these same scholarly indicators to a 3D model. And today I'll present some insights and reflections on my experiences with applying this concept of paradata in a kind of data-driven storytelling technique. So in my talk today, I will first briefly provide some background on the concept of 3D paradata and its current intersection with the online dissemination of heritage visualization. Then I'll introduce the paradata puzzle, like what is the broader discourse surrounding 3D scholarship and where does it fit in? And to contextualize this problem, I'll situate it within the research scope and goals of the PURE3D project. So more specifically, I'll focus on the role of that 3D web viewing interface for curating the 3D paradata around the model, and doing that for different audiences within the conceptual framework of what we call a 3D scholarly edition. And yeah, following this, I'll do some demonstrations of several 3D editions that we've supported in which creators have, whether intentionally or not, practically applied the concept of paradata into their 3D narratives using the Smithsonian Voyager toolkit. And then I'll conclude with some reflections on the role of 3D viewing platforms as tools for paradata-led narratives, as well as insights gained from a recent workshop on 3D paradata for heritage scholarship that was held here in Leiden just a few weeks ago. So what is 3D paradata? Well, briefly defined, it's a catch-all term for any and all information and multimedia resources that relate to the process of creating a 3D asset. The term paradata is actually borrowed from qualitative methods in which collected interview or survey data is supplemented with additional information on how that study was designed or executed. And then in the early 2000s, paradata was introduced and reframed for the humanities community, as there was a similar need for transparency of heritage visualization as they were generated by computer graphics at that time. So in this conceptualization, paradata information may include descriptions of the scholarly workflow or technical devices used, but it differs from metadata for 3D in that it provides some context and rationale behind the controlled metadata description. So for example, a 3D digitization project was executed using the photogrammetry method. Photogrammetry would go into the metadata field for method employed. And the paradata about this could be, why was this method chosen over others? Perhaps it's because the materiality of the object or the goals of the project determine this choice. Like, for example, perhaps it was due to project constraints, such as access to more expensive capture devices, or time limitations, or the technical expertise of the team members involved in that project. Ultimately, Paradata entails the subjective interpretive process with detailed explanations of decisions made, project realization, and/or the relationship of the 3D asset to other research in the field. And yeah, why is 3D Paradata necessary to document? Well, without it, others cannot validate the 3D research as suitable for scholarly reuse. So firstly, a detailed reporting of the creation process signals to others the reliability and scholarly rigor of the 3D output, thereby fostering trust in the accuracy of this representation. Alongside this, transparent communication of the methods and rationale allows others to critically assess the quality of that modeling process, and thus integrating it into that wider academic discourse. So without some kind of documentation, we wouldn't really be able to determine what part of the 3D model is based on reality and what has been fabricated, altered, or introduced. So finally, if Paradata is documented in a sustainable and coherent way, it can help to ensure the 3D model's reusability. And I use that term reusability both in the context of technological advancements. So this may impact the data's capability to be read or migrated into newer viewing frameworks, which is already a problem today. But it also speaks to the practice of passing down research knowledge. So over the years, we've come to see the value of 3D, not just for its visual appeal, but also for the intellectual work that goes into the undertaking. And within the scholarly landscape, the topic of Paradata for heritage visualization is part of an ongoing dialogue about how to define and document it, as well as how to package, store, and present it to various stakeholders. So Paradata is viewed as one of these critical elements for integrating 3D into the scholarly ecosystem. However, what's still required is this community accepted standard for a structured Paradata model, as well as incentives to comply with that model and to implement it into your 3D project. So coming up with this model for Paradata is not an easy undertaking. This is largely due to the diversity of humanities subjects and the 3D technologies that could be applied. Therefore, a Paradata model needs to be able to be flexible and to accommodate many different scenarios and use cases. And even if we do have a Paradata standard, how do we convince researchers to do even more work, both in terms of learning how to comply with it, how to fill out this data model, and then implement it for their project? So to illustrate this idea of reusability in practical terms, I'll describe a potential scenario of a future researcher. So this is Dorian. He lives in the year 2033. He's a Central American archaeologist, and he has excavated in an institutional digital repository a 3D replica of an ancient Mayan stela that was made using a structured light scanner from circa 2018. So he's doing research on the visual languages embedded on these stelae to better understand the ancient Mayan knowledge systems. So firstly, when Dorian encounters this, he notices that the 3D model is in a file format that's outdated for modern online viewing, but that's okay because he's able to convert it to the new standard file format so he can view it in his VR headset. Secondly, in order to use this 3D model to do his analysis of the pictorial representations that are on the stela, he needs to know how the model was made and at what level the quality the 3D data is in. So for Dorian, a high resolution image quality or color accuracy are not that necessary, but it is important that the geometric resolution is detailed enough for him to identify the figures and features that are engraved on that stela. And by reading the Paradata documentation for this model, Dorian realizes that the specific model was created for rapid online consumption by public audiences and therefore needed to be optimized for early 21st century web standards. So in other words, this model was decimated to 200,000 faces from its original 3.2 million faces. So because of this, the model is not sufficient for highly accurate surface inspection, but it can still be used for shape analysis or to do some generic measurements. However, the Paradata documentation also points to an original high-resolution dataset, which was stored locally in the University of Nebraska. So this lower resolution model is still useful for Dorian because he's able to get a general view of the model and to know that it has features that will be useful for his research question. But he does have to still inquire with the university to get access to the original heavier data to do a more detailed inspection. So I see this scenario as helping to foreground the current landscape of 3D scholarship within the wider digital heritage sector. So most notably is this European Commission investment in 3D-focused cultural heritage initiatives and the development of pan-European infrastructure, such as the Common European Data Space and a collaborative cloud. In addition to this, EU member states are also encouraged through campaigns like the recent Twin It to 3D digitize their cultural heritage. So therefore, the next 5 years will be a pivotal moment for 3D scholarship, with the volume of 3D presented online surpassing the total produced over the past 4 decades. And this surge in 3D digitization underscores this urgency of requiring the co-publication of 3D paradata alongside these 3D digital assets. So yeah, we've established that paradata for 3D is necessary, and it's needed for integrating it into the wider scholarly landscape. And this topic also relates to like wider calls in academia to make data of any kind fair. So yeah, fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. However, in a fair and structured format, the paradata might only be understandable for other 3D technicians or data scientists, or perhaps an AI model in the future will be trained to interpret it. But for many other audiences, including humanities researchers, a detailed, structured, and machine-readable paradata might as well be written in another language, and then it will be quickly discarded. So at the end of the day, who or what is paradata really for? Is it the sole intention of reporting paradata to signal that this model has been done in a scholarly way and therefore it's trustworthy? Or is it to act as a backup in case of a 3D data obsolescence? So yes, I think these are certainly very valid reasons, but I question whether we should be doing more and better to reuse and reframe paradata for public and specialist audiences. And I suggest that this can be done in a curated approach and presented dynamically using web-based 3D viewing frameworks. However, the added challenge or the puzzle is how do we curate this unstructured data-led narrative in a way that is digestible for any type of audience member? To tackle this challenge, I believe a combined approach is a good solution when publishing 3D models online. So firstly, and as a bare minimum, each 3D heritage asset, whether it's created through the capture method or through a reconstruction technique, should have a structured paradata documentation that is both human and machine readable. This may look like a paradata dossier or a project archive that is curated and enriched with any relevant information about the 3D project. And then all of these kind of information and files can be deposited together with those 3D models into a trusted repository. So doing this would fulfill the call to make paradata fair and to comply with the level of academic posterity that is being asked. However, in addition to that, I argue that we should also be encouraging diverse science communication strategies of that structured paradata. So in other words, let's reframe most of this information as a narrative about your creation process and utilize the affordances of the 3D viewing interface to do so. This facilitates that reusability of paradata in a more accessible way so that it can be consumed by a wider audience. So I see this, to do this requires some decisions regarding the communication strategy. I see these decisions are largely interdependent on 3 factors. So first is the conceptual framework that one chooses for reporting and communicating paradata. I see this as often depending on the project itself and the methods of creating that 3D asset. And second, who is the intended audience for the 3D visualization, and then by extent, the 3D paradata? Is it exclusively for public facing audience, or is the intended demographic more for scholars and specialists of the topic? Can the two be combined so you don't have to do double the work? Finally, I believe that the 3D viewing platform or infrastructure also plays a major role in the curation and presentation of 3D paradata or 3D assets in general. So the publishing decision will prescribe how paradata is populated and presented to the intended audience. And this in turn will ultimately determine the conceptual framework that you're going to choose. So yeah, the decision factors come back into a full circle. And in terms of the conceptual framework of a 3D narrative, I've primarily adopted the concept of a 3D scholarly edition. And this is based on the publishing approach of a digital scholarly edition, which is borrowed from the literary tradition, whereby a text is annotated and augmented with supplementary information or translation decisions in a digital research environment. And this mapping of the concept to 3D heritage was initially proposed by my supervisors, Susan and Costas, and it was tested and problematized through the objectives of the PURE3D project. In their article, they define what is a 3D scholarly edition, which is an immersive, multivariant, and multisensorial information space that uses 3D objects or virtual worlds to convey a scholarly argument in a single spatiotemporal environment. So as such, the 3D environment becomes richly contextualized for others by means of multimodal annotation and documentation of metadata and paradata, thereby providing users with access to modeling and interpretive choices. So with this idea of a 3D edition and an argument that there is a missing centralized digital space for 3D scholarship, Costas and Susan secured funding for the PURE3D project from the PDI SSH grant, which is a one-off funding instrument aimed at supporting infrastructure developments in the Netherlands. So PURE3D started in 2021 and it finished in December 2024. And the project goals, which were to a large extent fulfilled, were to firstly develop an infrastructure for authoring and viewing 3D scholarly editions, and that you can access at this editions.pure3d.eu. Secondly, we wanted to provide a system and tools for depositing these editions, including the files associated with them under the FAIR principles. And ultimately, the goal was to provide a framework, both conceptual and methodological, for recognizing and rewarding interactive 3D scholarship. So that covers the decisions regarding conceptual framework and publishing platform. And what's left is decide on the interactive viewing environment. So lucky for us, we have a decent number of options, which are designed for interacting with 3D heritage on the web. However, each framework has its own affordances and limitations. For example, some focus more on general audiences, but then they lack rich features for data interaction, while others are designed for handling single 3D object exploration rather than complex virtual worlds. And for the purposes of developing a 3D infrastructure, our PURE3D criteria centered on accommodating a diverse range of 3D heritage types, so from single objects to virtual worlds. But we also focused on accessibility. So accessibility both in terms of technical usability by individuals with varying levels of digital literacy, as well as long-term accessibility for the maintenance of the software. So yeah, among these frameworks, the Voyager toolkit really stood out for its intuitive interface, as well as being really well documented and open source. So it's developed and maintained by the Smithsonian Digitization Program Office as a storytelling medium for their vast collection of 3D digitized collections. And although the framework is designed more for the single object viewing, it is possible to also include complex 3D scenes. So with the authoring interface, Voyager story creators are able to see real time their digital experience come to life in the user side, which is that of Voyager Explorer. So this is possible without needing developer skills or having to exit and open a new window. And the framework utilizes familiar 3D viewing features and conventions, including hotspot annotation, guided tours, and longer form text that allow embedding various multimedia resources. Additionally, it can also include some analytical tools like measurement, slice, material state change, as well as visibility, toggling on and off of the 3D models. So within the PURE3D project timeframe, we were able to support the creation of more than 50 editions, which are currently published on the final infrastructure. I believe that this was possible to a large extent because of the ease of Voyager as an editing interface. And what was more challenging for our participants was really coming up with this concept of what is an edition, or rather what is object-based narrative building in a three-dimensional environment. And among these editions, there's a significant number which tackle the idea of paradata and transparent communication of 3D building, 3D creation. And these examples include both digitized objects, so these single objects, as well as the virtual worlds, and the topics range from history to art to archaeology, paleontology, and more. In addition, we also have an entire series of digitized toys, which were created by master's students at Maastricht University. And because of the digital self-reflexivity, is a core aspect of the MA trajectory at Maastricht, we did require our students to dedicate an entire sub-narrative to technical and theoretical reflections on their creation process. So in other words, we required them to do a Paradata tour. However, it's interesting to note that in the context of creating this edition, all of these authors have different levels of understanding of the Paradata concept. Most of them, especially the students, have no experience or knowledge of the concept, while others, namely the 3D visualization experts, are really familiar with the term. And ultimately, all of the creators who included a kind of Paradata tour did so as a means of providing some contextual background and documentation of the creation process and its challenges and limitations. So this is a word cloud of the titles that we would consider to be a Paradata tour of the editions that are published on PURE3D. And you can see that there's no reference to the term Paradata itself. Rather, this term is expressed as digitization process, development, making of, behind the scenes, journey, reflections, report. And these terms are familiar because they're used to signal to readers an objective for transparent communication of the creation process. So, and for these edition creators, the challenge was to communicate their 3D edition process, but to do so using the various components and affordances of the Voyager framework. So we didn't provide any blueprint on how this is supposed to look, We did give some ideas or examples of what could be done within the confines of Voyager, but we left it open to interpretation on how they decided what was relevant or interesting to tell for their audience and how to implement this within the constraints of the software. And with each round of PURE3D participants and student groups, we saw new approaches of creative experimentation with Voyager to achieve these expressions of many of these core Paradata-like concepts, such as project context and background, data sources, creation process, modeling decisions. And in the following slides, I'll demonstrate and discuss some excerpts of these additions and how they interpret and manifest 3D Paradata using Voyager's flexible framework. So the first category is that of project context. Context can refer to historical, cultural, and project-based information that is important for users to have in order to understand how that 3D model that they are viewing is just a piece of the broader phenomenon. So many participants decided to provide some short contextual information about the project, in which they included either text description, images, hyperlinks, or logos, as well as references and acknowledgements. So, for example, some of these students chose to situate their project as belonging to the Toys with Voice collection, which is part of the digital collections course of the MA Digital Cultures at Maastricht University. So there's a lot of layers of context there. In other cases, the addition was made as a way to do science communication of a master's dissertation or to act as a supplement for a postdoctoral monograph. For others, the 3D models were made in the context of a commemorative anniversary or through a grant-funded project. And including this kind of information, not just in the structured data documentation, so in that standardized Paradata format, but also in this interactive narrative, makes it explicit for whatever audience, the objectives and the scope of the edition. So project can also relate to authorship. And in an academic setting, knowing who made the 3D model can be beneficial information for others in order to assess the level of quality of the 3D model or of the level of quality of the research that is being populated therein. And for example, are they an amateur 3D modeler doing this for a course project, or are they a seasoned 3D technical expert? For a general audience, they probably don't need to know this, but providing these bio notes does serve to humanize and personalize the work. And in the case of the student 3D editions, we encourage them to introduce themselves as a 3D editor, 3D creators, and as a way to give a bit of autobiographical context to their readers. And instead of including just like real pictures of themselves, many of the students were able to have fun and play with the visual themes of their particular toy. So they asked AI generators to imagine them as Pixar characters or Muppets or dolls or court jesters or anime characters. So temporal context is also sometimes explored using Voyager tools. As heritage professionals, we know that the passage of time and human nature processes introduce untold numbers of changes to the material remains. And communicating this to the public and expert audiences is often necessary in order for them to get orientated to the time and space. For example, the 4D Walk Around the Block edition documents different construction phases and architectural styles of a neighborhood in Amsterdam through a series of thematic tours. Also in the same edition, the passage of time is visualized through dynamic transitions between these different construction phases. Similarly, the 3D Duvelstein project walks backward in time, starting from a photogrammetrical model of the position and remains of a megalithic tomb as it was captured in 2017, and then comparing this with a citizen science project in which the historical photos illuminate the shifting of the stones from the early 20th century to the modern day context. Then the edition walks back even further in time to imagine how the stones would have been positioned when it was first constructed. So these different models can be toggled using the annotation tag feature in Voyager, while a more robust narrative about the stones' change over time is communicated through the interactive tours. Space, as well as time, is a really important piece of contextual information that can be integrated into the 3D environment. This is done both as a means of enriching the narrative, as well as providing supporting evidence for the visualization. So, for example, within many of the 3D editions, we see spatial context is dealt with through the integration of both modern and historical maps. So in this edition particularly, the maps are used to demonstrate the sources and evidence for the reconstruction of the wider landscape around the historical neighborhood. And providing this both in map and 3D formats helps to connect spatial context to related socioeconomic topics that would be of interest for this neighborhood. In addition to maps and site plans, other sources of data can be integrated into the 3D environment as a means of communicating the basis of evidence for hypothetical 3D reconstruction. So, for example, historical illustrations or modern images can be dynamically integrated and positioned in relation to the main 3D model. For this edition, the integration of strategically placed images reveals how they were used in order to track the historical changes of the megalithic tombs. In this case, the placement of the images in Voyager reflects back to the author's original modeling process, which was done in the Blender modeling software using the same technique. And in this way, the data sources become themselves contextualized with regard to their usage and relationship to the 3D model. And this edition applies the same approach, but he also incorporates the practice of linked open data. And he does this by including the URI hyperlinks that helps to report and provide the sources as further information without overwhelming the reader. So in the case of this edition, the reconstruction sources are revealed both internally and externally from the 3D edition space. And it's attempting to accommodate both casual viewing as well as use cases in which accessing more information about these sources might be important for other users. And besides images and URI links, the 3D scene itself can be configured and coordinated in a way that makes clear the rationale and basis for the reconstruction. And this edition of a medieval church from mines demonstrates how an archaeological site plan can be reimagined in the virtual environment. So Igor uses model movement and visibility to visually demonstrate how the data sources were used to extrapolate a possible original version of the church. And he complements these interactions of the 3D scene with annotations, both as hotspots of particular features, as well as in the form of image and text on the side panel. And in terms of the creation process of 3D modeling itself, we saw some really creative usage of Voyager function to demonstrate process-related aspects of the modeling technique. So Louise does this by first explaining the method of photogrammetry within an article, and then using the camera view and movements to mimic the physical act of taking multiple photos in a hemisphere around the real world object, which is what you need to do for photogrammetry. Also related to research process, this edition of the whale bottle shoe integrates CT scan slices with the 3D model. And this was a rather simple but impactful way to show for museum audiences the combination of two very different scanning techniques that the object underwent. And in the same 3D space, it's made clear that the CT scans were used to understand the internal structure of the object and its material composition, while the 3D model provides a way to investigate the external form of that object. So this is an edition done by one of our student pairs, and they took this idea of showing process very literally. They attempted a recreation of the physical space and the props in and around their object. So here you can see in the scene that there are two female figures. You can also see they have their digital setup, which includes a camera on a tripod that's looking towards a Lazy Susan turntable. And on top of the Lazy Susan is a green floral foam block that supports a small penny doll, which in turn is supported by small needles to keep her upright and fixed. So this edition both explicitly and implicitly details their process while also pointing out challenges and limitations with the materiality of the object. Additionally, they use annotation to identify areas that were heavily edited because they didn't have a good way to get images for those areas. So many other student groups encountered similar obstacles due to the materiality of their object, which ultimately dictated their creation process. So for example, the plastic eyes of Kermit were too shiny for the photogrammetry technique, and this resulted in a poor geometric processing. And again, while trying to straighten the product tag on Kermit's back using hair straightener, they accidentally burned off the tag. So instead of including poor visual geometry or missing features, they decided to combine the digitization technique and a reconstruction method by reinserting hand-modeled eyes and a product tag. And this was only possible because one of the students was a hobbyist 3D artist. So she was really highly skilled to do this kind of integration. And you might read about that in her bio note. And in other projects, it might be relevant that the author further elaborates their rationale behind their decision-making process, especially for reconstruction of hypothetical past environments. So for example, in this edition, the concept of uncertainty was visually communicated inside and outside of 3D space by detailing the certainty index applied using an article, and then juxtapositioning this with a 3D representation of that color-coded index. In other cases, uncertainty can be expressed in alternative ways. So for 3D generated by photogrammetry, some editions utilize hotspot annotation and camera movement to highlight areas of imperfect or missing data. And they do this while they're explaining their limitations in the modeling process. So not only is this just an interesting part of the story of the 3D object, but it also allows others to assess the resolution and the validity of the model. In addition to uncertainty, alternative variants or hypotheses of 3D representations can be communicated to the audience. And in Voyager, this was done using dynamic model manipulation combined with the research narrative via articles. Also multimedia that was used to inform the variants are referenced and connected to the decision-making process. So for his edition of the Church in Mainz, Igor presented a supplementary model to represent all of his alternative variants for how the church could have been reconstructed. And then he explains and justifies why the one chosen variant was further modeled. Additionally, the 3D scene can be manipulated to interrogate or test alternative scenarios. For example, between tour steps, the 3D Duvelstein edition questions the height and visibility of the earthen mound on top of the megalithic tomb by adjusting the 3D volume of the hill to reveal or hide the large stones. Because visual media can be interpreted differently by everyone, both editions complement these 3D graphics with their text-based narrative about how we, as the readers, should understand the nature of their alternative hypotheses. So I felt that these Voyager examples have been really insightful for me as I think about what are the practical applications of 3D Paradata and its role in the wider scholarly discourse. So firstly, data-led, or rather Paradata-led narratives, as expressed in the 3D medium, can be a powerful tool for adhering to calls for transparency of computer-generated heritage visualization. And I feel this is useful not just for the public, but also for professionals and researchers as a way to access process-related information in a more intuitive way. And it demonstrates a desire to show as well as tell. And Voyager allows this to be done both in a linear and nonlinear way through the annotations, articles, and tours, combined with dynamic interaction. And as such, we can have two or more narrative streams in the same spatio-temporal environment. So for example, we can have a few narratives about the original object biography, and then one about the 3D object's biography. So, however, I do agree with a wider visualization community that we also need a structured, machine-readable, and fair version of that same information. Ultimately, I feel the narrative-driven 3D modality should be a complement and not a replacement for a parallel Paradata document. Furthermore, I've seen that Paradata narratives shouldn't follow any blueprint or convention, since, as you saw in the demonstrations, every 3D model is unique in how it's made, who made it, and why they made it. Therefore, the 3D biography should be told in a way that does justice to its unique creation story. Another thing I wonder about is the suitability of Voyager as a tool for communicating Paradata. It's great for storytelling, but I question whether these affordances are fit for the purpose of 3D scholarly publication. And sometimes I feel like we're asking too much of Voyager when perhaps another 3D viewing framework would be better for this dynamic Paradata interaction and documentation. However, regardless of the conceptual framework or the 3D viewing interface that you choose, I envision that this can be done by populating a 3D narrative with different densities of information in contextually appropriate places for the intended audiences. Ultimately, even for experts on the topic, such a 3D publication can be an engaging starting point for delving deeper into more specific levels of information, as well as providing access to raw data. So those were some of my own personal experiences and perspectives on Paradata and how it can be manifested outside of this kind of structured data model. But there's a rather rich community of professionals and academics who are also concerned with advancing Paradata to the next stage. I was fortunate to be part of a workshop on 3D Paradata in which the community of diverse stakeholders problematized the complexity of defining and disseminating Paradata for different types of 3D heritage assets. And the group decided that first and foremost, yes, we need a data model, and it should be a bare minimum information that is universally applicable to every heritage project, every 3D heritage project. And besides this, it should also be able to accommodate the unique nuances and qualities that are inherent to cultural heritage and the methods applied for researching and documenting it in 3D. And then following this, the data model should be recognized as an international standard, but it should also not be too burdensome for project members of any technical or data science background to implement in their project. And we briefly explored UX UI solutions for encouraging compliance and executing human and machine readable documents, such as a fillable form, or maybe something that's automatically generated as like a kind of processing report. And the workshop concluded with wireframing activities in which we imagined and collaborated on software solutions to integrate Paradata into 3D virtual environments. The outcome of this will be new features and functionalities in Voyager and or the PURE3D software. So to conclude, I believe that Paradata is one of these critical elements for validating 3D scholarship as a reusable research resource. However, the puzzle, as I see it, is figuring out where and how Paradata is dispersed and disseminated to these different actors. And this puzzle, much like cakes and onions and ogres, has many layers. At the first layer, we need a flexible documentation standard for structured Paradata that conforms to fair data principles. And then at the second layer, we need people to comply with this documentation standard. So in order to make this a reality, compliance should not be too cognitively burdensome or time-consuming. There's really already a strain on heritage professional staff and resources as it is. And if filling out Paradata is too complex, then it just won't be done. Similar to this is the layer of recognition for 3D scholarship. Consequently, Paradata is also a key component for implementing a peer review process of 3D publications. And having both Paradata documentation and a peer review will hopefully signal to others that this 3D publication is of scholarly, rigorous work. And in order to make this all practically possible, we need institutional and technical support in order to keep and maintain 3D data and its associated Paradata alive via web infrastructures. And finally, in connection to this idea of infrastructure, what we really do need is a diverse and united community to help support and sustain these other layers so that 3D remains relevant and meaningful for present and future generations. And through the course of my PhD, I'm coming to believe that this is a really core area to focus on in the next few years, because without a strong community of users, then the infrastructure and therefore the raw 3D data just will become irrelevant and obsolete. I also feel from my experience that with PURE3D, that this 3D community has to be defined by more than just 3D practitioners, technicians, or research interest groups. It should accommodate any interested party who wants to be able to engage with 3D in a critical way. So that should be done regardless of their knowledge and skills with 3D. Therefore, community support and guidance should be built directly into these interfaces for 3D heritage. Finally, through all of these layers, I wonder about the role that generative AI will play in some or all of these layers. For example, will it be used to write Paradata so as to alleviate the burden for humans? Or will it be used to read structured Paradata documents and then interpret it based on specific queries? Or both, so that AI-generated data is reading and interpreting other AI-generated data? I don't yet know where AI fits into the future of 3D Paradata and therefore the future of 3D scholarship, but I do know that it will be a major player. So thank you for your attention, and also thank you to the DAG organizers for inviting me to present on my work. I encourage you to check out some of the additions on the PURE3D infrastructure. And I'd also like to mention that PURE3D will be supporting more 3D editions in the near future. So please get in touch with me if you or someone you know might be interested to create their own edition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kelly, so much. Maybe I'll stop the recording for the discussion. Is that it? If I can figure out how to do that. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat.